designed typologies of the beach house. And then these kind of completely local, but still universal, because there are beaches all over the world, typologies also get taken up by architects, by people like Craig Elwood, etc. So in no time, Richard Neutra, Schindler, in no time, this condition of immensely fast urbanization plus a completely original and unique landscape condition, it creates new architectural typologies and new urban lifestyles at the same time. And the first ecology he talks about is the beach. And then he talks about the foothills, where the mountains, the Los Angeles mountains meet the plains. And you have the Hollywood Hills, but also the Santa Monica Canyon and the Topanga Canyon. You have this, where you have this kind of urban situation where you have very steep hills and canyons and creeks and cliffs and urbanization and an entirely new lifestyle and a gathering of for example, during the 30s and 40s, modernist architects coming in, fleeing the Nazis, coming to Los Angeles and building things. So you have a kind of modernism that travels all the way to Los Angeles and there mutates in this kind of science fiction architecture. So this is the ecology of the foothills that has produced these crazy, crazy houses that you now see in hip-hop clips. And then he talks about a very interesting typology or ecology, what he calls the plains of id. And id is a kind of, he uses it it's kind of inspired by the Freudian term of id, this part of your consciousness that is completely left to imagination to be filled in. So what you have is this enormous prairie-like plain in between the Pacific Ocean, the beach, and the foothills. These enormous, like kilometers and kilometers and kilometers of flat land. And then this flat land is cut through and irrigated by the Pacific Electric Railroad, which is a kind of suburban railroad. Endless amounts of tram lines are cut through it, and so immediately this plain becomes irrigated with infrastructure, and it becomes one of the fastest and freest suburban developments ever. But it's also for the middle classes, the lower middle classes, they all come there and they find a kind of freedom and a kind of empty plain on which everybody can enact their fantasies. It's a very, very modernist, typical 60s way of reading this exploitation of this zone in Los Angeles by Rainer Banham. And of course, the place that we are talking about is exactly the place where the riots and all this poverty and violence later was grown. So it's the zone, but you can see Watts there, Torrance, Hawthorne. So it's this whole area was cut through with this Pacific Electric Highway, train line. Here you can see it. And this is also where the factories came, a lot of car factories, a lot of arms industry also here. And it's a possibility. That's how Los Angeles also functioned. You remember maybe this also from old movies, the idea of Los Angeles, California, the West, as where the pioneer would go to, and that's where he would settle, because that's where everyone would have a possibility of living a rich life in this permanently beautiful weather underneath the palm trees. And more or less this area, this plains area, gave the possibility for even the lower middle classes to live in something that was a relative paradise, relatively had the possibilities of being a paradise. because they had enormous amounts of space. There were many, many jobs. They had this fantastic tramway system that took them everywhere through this area. And then they could live there in these beautiful little houses with their white picket fences underneath the palm trees, etc. So this area created the California dream for millions of people at the same time. That was the kind of idea of this. And it, for example, this is why one of the most important buildings for Reyner Banham was the famous Watts Towers, built by, I think he was a Romanian immigrant. Because another thing I forgot to mention, who would live in these plains? People from everywhere, of course, not just Americans, new Americans. First generation immigrants from all over the world would come there and would escape the confines and the depressed conditions of old Europe. And they would land on this futuristic plain, and they would live the life that they could have only dreamt of. That was the idea. And one of these people who did that was this Simon Rodia. I think he was Romanian. And after a whole life of having jobs, etc., he worked on his own fantasy, the Watts Towers. A kind of crazy, crazy architectural... This guy had nothing to do with architecture. I think he was a postman or something like that. I'll look it up. But and he built this crazy architectural fantasy out of concrete and steel and seashells and pieces of glass, and he worked on it for 30, 40 years, and now it still is one of the... If you go to Los Angeles, you should absolutely go and visit it. It's a UNESCO landmark, I even think. And for Reyner Banham, this proved that this enormous plain was more than just a banal piece of land where people just lived their banal suburban lives. This proved that this was the plains of id, where you enact your subconsciousness, where even the lower middle classes, even workers from Romania, would come to America and they could live out their dreams. And here you see it in 1970, standing next to one of the train lines. And already here, and this is also what Reyner Banham describes in his book, already here you see the pending doom of this area. Because what happened after the 50s and 60s, exactly the same as what happened in Detroit. The car manufacturers lobbied and lobbied and lobbied until all the train lines were taken away in order that people would buy cars, in order that and drive through the city. Even if in this area the people did not yet, and a lot of them still don't, have cars to drive through this area. So this is an abandoned railway line. So you could see that what happened from the 40s and 50s onwards is that the Pacific Electric was stripped away from the plains of id, as Banham called them. And this area was also the place, by the way, where in the 30s and 40s also the social housing projects of Los Angeles were built. And as you can see, they are of a different nature than the ones in Detroit and New York and the East Coast cities, because they are low-rise. But still they are enormous complexes of 2 to 3 story strip blocks that were first built for black middle and lower class people, and then of course after the civil rights made it possible for people to move out, they also became here you have them, they became ghettos for poor blacks, as happened everywhere. So this is what it looked like when they were just built. This is what they were looking like when Reyner Banham was driving through them in 1971. This is from his film. And this is what they look like now. Now they look They look like a Dutch asielzoekerscentrum. But as you completely fenced up, etc. And this is also some of the worst parts of the ghetto right now. Anyway, we move on to what happened to the... So this is the fourth ecology that Banham talks about. And it is the... I can't take this call. And it is autopia. So not utopia, but autopia. So the freeway system was built as a kind of second floor over the entire area of the city. Often on stilts, often flying over it, and all of a sudden making it possible to nearly use the city as you would use the television, that you would zap. You could go like in 5 minutes from one corner of the city to the other, where it would have taken you an hour before. The freeway system on an urban scale meant the death of distance. It meant that distance was, for those with a car, was completely contracted. But it also meant that distance was expanded for the people in between, because they lost their tramway. Meaning that from a place that was perfectly connected to everywhere, this Watts area all of a sudden became perfectly disconnected from everywhere. But it also produced something else, and that is what the fourth ecology talks about. And it's in the first paragraph of this episode in his book, that Rainer Banham has a kind of epiphany. He sees how a woman behind, the girl beside the driver, pulled down the sun visor and used the mirror on the back of it to tidy her hair. Only when I had seen a couple more incidents of the kind did I catch their import. That coming off the freeway is coming in from outdoors. So he discovers that once people drive off the highway, off the off-ramp, they start doing things to their hair. Like people would do if they step into a house. So all of a sudden, through these kinds of, Rainer Banham, this British guy with a beard, so he starts looking at how people behave on the highway and how the car becomes a kind of a space, and the city has to be completely reread through this use of the car and re-described in terms of inside and outside that before were completely different. And also what he describes in this book is the effect of flirting in a car, so that you could flirt from one car to another. And this was also an epiphany for him, that the freeway was a social space. The freeway was a public space, not just a road, but a public space. So you could say that a part of the urban life, part of the social life, was displaced from the sidewalk to the freeway. But of course, and Rainer Banham was not unaware of this. However, he was so caught up in his own optimism that he did not talk about it too much. The sidewalks also still existed. And the sidewalks was exactly where, a couple of years before he wrote this book, the riots of '65 had exploded. Here you see here you can see the thick black lines describe the freeways that cut through everything, and also cut up everything in huge. And you can see the enormous scale of areas like this and this that become kind of black holes also in the cultural conscious of the city. Here you see him driving his car. He learned to drive for this film. Before that he couldn't drive. This is Autopia. And then the epilogue is, he says that of course a lot of people were then complaining about that there was no public transit anymore, that a lot of people were saying cars are bad, you should have public transport, etc. And then he says that the funny thing is that the only place where you have a very sophisticated